diretor Edward Buckles tinha 12 anos quando o furacão Katrina assolou New Orleans. Do desastre ambiental ao desastre social, o Katrina revelou que em casos de calamidade climática, são também as populações mais vulneráveis que sofrem. Os moradores da cidade que ocupavam os bairros mais carentes, a grande maioria negra, perderam tudo. Foram deixados sem respostas, sem o acolhimento necessário e tiveram de encarar um trauma ainda maior ao se verem negligenciados pelas autoridades de seu próprio país. O Katrina não atingiu New Orleans, foram nossos diques que falharam e isso tem tudo a ver com desigualdade, comentou o diretor em conversa com a Mostra Ecofalante. Milhares de crianças encararam esse evento tão traumático e cresceram também sem apoio psicológico necessário. Eles são os Katrina Babies, ou os filhos do Katrina, que hoje ainda encaram o desafio de lidar com o trauma e de reconstruir suas vidas em um futuro em que tragédias ambientais e sociais como Katrina não vão se repetir. Além de um filme contundente sobre o desastre ambiental, Filhos do Katrina é um filme sobre o trauma, sobre como lidar e como superá-lo. Conversamos mais sobre isso com o Edward Buckles e ele começou contando como, apesar dos Estados Unidos serem referência em país rico e com estrutura, a realidade muitas vezes é mais complexa do que pensamos e que por isso filmes como o seu são tão importantes.
I always say this, people always want to have the conversation about, the environment and have a conversation about climate change and, just like what's happening with those things. But it's like, for most people who are, poor and disenfranchised, they can't even begin to grasp that because, what's impacting them is not just the disaster, but also race and inequality, right? So it's like, for example, with Hurricane Katrina, it wasn't really the storm. We got missed by Hurricane Katrina, right? We didn't get hit by Hurricane Katrina. Our levees failed and the poor Black neighborhoods were the ones that were flooded. The more wealthier neighborhoods and the more touristy spots were just fine. In fact, they were up and running in just a few days and in some cases a few weeks, as opposed to, it being 2023 now, and some of our neighborhoods are still, destroyed. So that has everything to do with race and inequality. I think that when it comes to disasters, those things play a large role at the same time as resource allocation. Who gets the funding, who gets the transportation, who gets saved, right? Who gets, the mental health resources and tools. So I think that, yes, we are in a very tough spot when it comes to, climate change and what's happening with our environment. But for, people who are poor and disenfranchised, they're also dealing with race and inequality and environmental racism.
And I think your film is quite important and timeless. I don't think it's related to only Katrina, as you say. We can discuss many other issues,
I mean, there's a quote that Andre 3000 made quite famous, but it's just, across cultures, darker people suffer more. Why? And I think that, what you just said is spot on. Using Hurricane Katrina as an example, when you look at the archival footage of what happened during Hurricane Katrina, and when you watch the news footage and you see the people who were, on their roofs, asking for help, or you see the people who were dead in the street, or you see the people who were, on the bridge walking across, seeking shelter and seeking safety, why were they all Black people? You know what I'm saying? Like I don't think it's a coincidence there. I think that when you look at even the pandemic, yes, of course, the pandemic it's a world, it impacted the world, but it impacted, poor and Black people in a whole different way, poor Black and brown people in a totally different way, and again, I think that goes back to resource allocation and, who gets the help, like who has who has the proper setup or like the proper living conditions to where they could survive a disaster, where they could survive a pandemic, where they could survive a drought, or like, survive a, Great Depression, right? Who is in position to, I guess, like, survive those things? And like, I think that most of the time, poor Black people are not.
This kind of traumatic pain that you, especially in your film, kids keep inside. This is so crucial for contemporary world, I believe. No, this is a very important issue, isn't it? Like, we usually don't talk about how we treat kids, especially poor kids from this kind of environments. In Brazil, it's such a big issue as well that we don't talk enough, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there's this common misconception and misunderstanding that, a child doesn't understand what's happening during a disaster, or a child, can't really process what's happening, during trauma, or a child is going to grow out of their trauma, right? So what happens is they get ignored and they get neglected, while the things that are more serious, quote unquote, get the attention, right? And, sometimes what happens with that, and what happened in my case, especially with Hurricane Katrina, is that, there was nothing in place for young people when we got back to New Orleans. There was nothing in place when it came to our mental health, when it came to our trauma, when it came to just making sure that we were okay. There was nothing in place. So once we got older, I'm now 30 years old. I was 13 during the storm, but once we got older, that trauma surfaced. And when our trauma surfaced, in the ways that it did, via behavior, via mental health, via relationships, and in some cases it surfaced in physical ways. But I think that when those things happen, we were blamed for it, and we were mislabeled as misbehaved and bad and criminals, and but no one had ever asked us how we felt after Hurricane Katrina. So, what did y'all expect to happen after you experience a great trauma like that, and you suppress all that, trauma inside of you? It's going to have to come out in one way or another. And I think that anxiety, PTSD, fight or flight, all of those things just kind of came out. And, I think that it's happening right now in New Orleans. Right now, New Orleans is, I'm not sure if you all know, but right now, New Orleans, as of September, we are like the murder capital, of the United States. And I don't think that it's a coincidence that, it's almost 18 years after Hurricane Katrina, and we are dealing with the last class. Like this year's class that graduates is the last class of the children who were born during Hurricane Katrina. And right now we are the murder capital.
After, the trauma, the big trauma, the hurricane passed, the hurricane of pandemic passed. Now we are like starting to breathe again, and all the trauma is coming, like anxiety, depression.
Yeah. And because the body, even if you think, even if you don't know why you're experiencing trauma, even if you don't understand or can't really process, what's happening with you, it's because your body knows, it's because, no matter what, the body is going to react to what it is experiencing, and I think that that's why conversations like this is so important. I think that that's why films like Katrina Babies and even y'all's film festival that puts a censored focus on this is so important, because so many people don't know what's happening with them, after they experience trauma, and they think that they're over it. So many people don't know what's going on with them. When I was 28, that was when I first really recognized that I had trauma, from Hurricane Katrina. It was while I was making a film, and, throughout my youth, I always knew that something was wrong, but I didn't know where it came from, because it seemed like it just came out of nowhere, right? But that's because like my body had kept score, and when it was time to release, it released, in many ways.
It's beautiful, the honest way that you put yourself in the movie, and how you reveal to us, almost at the end, not the end, but, how you see yourself in other young people.
Thank you for that. That process was as honest and as pure and organic as the process looked on film. That's really how it happened in real life. You may look at, like our film now, you may look at our poster and, you see my face all in it, right? I'm all in the film. I am, open and sharing my trauma, but it's important to understand that it took me 7 years to make this film, and I didn't insert my story into the film until year 5. I was very resistant to putting my story in it. And I was resistant to it, not because I didn't want to share it, but I didn't think that I had trauma worthy enough of sharing. I didn't think that my trauma was strong enough to, stand with the other people who had experienced these terrible things. And I was just so resistant to, sharing it. And then also I didn't know how to be vulnerable. It's not something that I learned as a young Black man. I didn't learn, how to be vulnerable and open. Sometimes in America and like sometimes in the world, it seems like, being vulnerable as a Black man is dangerous, so it was a very tough process, but it wasn't until I started being a high school teacher. And when I became a high school teacher and I was able to see myself within my students, and I was able to, relate to them, I was able to understand them, when their trauma surfaced, I wasn't one of the adults that was deeming them as bad. I was one of the adults that was asking, hey, what's going on? Like, are you okay? Like what's happening? And in that experience, it took me back to my youth, and it took me back to my childhood. And it, helped me to start that process to identify and own that I am too, traumatized. I am also dealing with trauma.
How this idea of making the film began?
So it goes back to what we just talked about, growing up in a post-Katrina New Orleans, growing up in a city that felt like it wasn't ready for young people, growing up in a city that felt like it was dangerous for young people. It felt like it like growing up in a post-Katrina New Orleans in a city, it felt like it failed us, that was my research and development. That's where everything started, unintentionally, right? That's where everything started. And fortunate enough for me, my mom put me into the arts when I was younger because I was acting out. And, I got into the arts and, I was showing interest in it already, but I learned about storytelling and, I learned about expression. I learned about, how healing those things were. So I wanted to pursue a career in that. So I wound up going to college for acting and theater. And through acting and theater, I got into writing, and I got into film classes. And when I first started working with cameras, which was actually like before film class, I fell in love with that medium. I felt like there was so much power in holding a camera directly to a person and hearing what they have to say. Me, Edward Buckles Jr., I am no different than some of the children who have been thrown away in New Orleans, and like some of the children who have been killed, some of the children who have been sent to jail. It's like I dealt with the same trauma that they dealt with. I dealt with the same neglect that they dealt with. I just maybe had one or two things that allowed me to skip something where and like shift my mind that I want to go and be in the arts. But it wasn't a big gap that separated me from them. So if I can do it, it's like, we have to believe that all of them can do it as well.
Mostra Ecofalante 2023. Fique de olho que ainda tem muito mais conversas, debates e sessões presenciais muito especiais vindo por aí.